More funding is coming the way of security agencies to confront the persistent security problems ravaging the country, as the National Assembly is passing a supplementary budget which is expected to see an upward review of the funding of some security agencies which were grossly underfunded or not funded in the appropriation bill. The National Assembly is approving the sum of 982.729 billion naira as supplementary budget, out of which 123 billion is for recurrent expenditure and 859 billion as contribution to the Development Fund for capital expenditure.
This House do consider the report of Committee on Appropriations for a bill for an act to authorize the issue of consolidated revenue fund of the Federation for the sum of 982,729,695,343 naira only.
The Minister of Finance, Zainab Ahmed, had disclosed to the Senate Committee on Army that the federal government spent about 54 billion naira in funding operations of the Nigerian Army between 2019 and 2021. Senate President Ahmed Lawan is asking the security-focused committees to ensure proper oversight of the deployment of the funds.
We expect our committees, the relevant committees, to be stiff, to be alive to their responsibilities for oversighting on how these funds will be deployed prudently.
The Senate is also approving President Buhari's request for the authorization of 2.343 trillion naira as external borrowing in the 2021 Appropriation Act, which would be used to fund specific capital projects from priority sectors of the economy. The approval by the upper chamber follows the consideration of a report by the Committee on Local and Foreign Debts and is coming amidst concerns about the country's rising debt profile.
The committee also knows that due to shortfall in our annual revenue in relation to our needs for rapid infrastructure and human capital development, we have had to pass deficit budget every year, requiring us to borrow to finance the deficit in our budget.
The new borrowing was calculated at an exchange rate of 379 naira to $1 and is expected to be sourced through the issuance of Eurobond in the international capital markets. Linda Akibi, Channels Television News.
All right, welcome back. So as you've seen there, Professor Ken Ife joins us to give his perspective on this subject matter. Good morning, Prof. Thank you for joining us today on the program. Now,
good morning, and thank you for having me.
All right, so funding the budget 2022, about 5.62 trillion naira deficit with borrowings. Yes, they've talked about prudent, applying the funds properly. But if you look at that, perhaps in context with debt to revenue, the service ratio, how sustainable do you think this is?
Well, first of all, let's agree that this amount of 5.6 trillion deficit has been agreed, that has been foreseen in the fiscal strategy paper and in the medium-term expenditure framework, and it was captured in the borrowing plan. And so it's not new money, as you will say, it has been agreed, and it has actually entered into the Appropriation Act for 2021. It's only just now that they want to operationalize it, so they need a resolution in the Senate to keep supporting that expenditure, and it is about 2.343 trillion that is up for raising. Now, back to how it sits within the macroeconomic framework and international best practices. The international best practice on loan for the debt, total debt to GDP is about 40%. We are around 21%. And don't forget that this is a moving target, because as we are taking loan, we are also liquidating loans. So that's why we've never faltered at all on debt service, even though the level of debt service is really open to question, and it could be better. That is actually where the risk is. Not on the borrowing, but the risk is on the ability to repay. And that raises a lot more questions than answers. But be it as it is, there is the necessity for us to fight COVID. And as you can see, we fought COVID to a standstill. and exited within a quarter. And you could only do that because of a macroeconomic handshake between fiscal and monetary authorities and a quantitative response to both sides of the GDP equation. So that's why we had money going into the consumer side and then also to the production side. So we actually exited very, very quickly. So very unusual times, but bear in mind that where these monies are targeted are critical areas of the economy. The power will need to support cement, transportation will need to build more rail, agriculture and rural development saw some Brazilian investment coming in, health sector, COVID vaccine has to be paid for, defense, more money is needed for security. And so human resource, you can't take it away because we've been heavily criticized on human resource development. That's education and health. So I can say that what the Senate President said is what we need to listen to, watching the integrity of the spend and ensuring that every penny is spent according to the rules.
But what about the component of that borrowing which goes into recurrent expenditure in trillions as well? Isn't that a concern?
Well, let's make a distinction between domestic borrowing, which could go anywhere, and foreign borrowing. That is where the Fiscal Responsibility Act 2007, which is actually now being amended, appeared in the Senate 2 days ago in the Senate Committee on Finance to encourage them to move the fiscal deficit envelope from 3 to 4% and stay so that we can stay within the ECOWAS macroeconomic convergence criteria, and even also make sure that the government is investing not less than 20% of their revenue and salaries capped to personnel costs capped to 35%. So all of those are boundary conditions of fiscal stability that ensure that we are not looking only on debt, we are not looking only on revenue, we are looking at the totality of all the elements that come into the equation of building a sound macroeconomic framework and public expenditure framework. So that was my advice to the Senate on Tuesday. But back to your question, yes, it is it's a moving target, to be honest. And I think there are good reasons for us to spend the money that we are spending right now. And the balance, see, the Fiscal Responsibility Act requires that any external borrowing has to be for capital projects and human resource development. So that is the law.
Just one moment. On that particular issue that you just raised now, much of the challenge here, from what Chamberlain asked, I mean, would be anyone's concern. For instance, why borrow for even domestically for servicing recurrent expenditure for salaries and things like that? For instance, there's this report by a budget that says the FG borrowed 1.42 trillion naira as domestic debt as of June 2020. It only spent 446 billion naira for capital items, which means it continues to borrow to maintain recurrent positions. How do we checkmate this? Because if this continues, it would mean that it's never going to end. I mean, you've talked about just 21% as opposed to 40%, but paying back, that's another kettle of fish altogether.
There are three issues here. One is that the government is always at liberty under the law to borrow to balance their budget. But there are different types of borrowing. In domestic borrowing, the law doesn't say anything about where to apply the money. So they might well use some of that proceeds to finance recurrent expenditure. But for external borrowing, the law is very explicit, and that is FRA 2007. It says only for the purpose of capital projects, because that's where jobs get created and all of that, and for human resource development. What the law didn't clarify is whether it is the human resource development associated with the capital expenditure that you are borrowing for, or just any human resource development. So that's where the law is vague. So I just couldn't take them to task on that. The law is vague on that. Then the second point that you raised is the integrity of the borrowing. It is a matter for the National Assembly. And that's why I'm saying the Senate President really put it down squarely, go and monitor this money. Because one thing is to borrow for a particular purpose, the other thing is to find the money going elsewhere. So that's what he said. And there's nothing me and you can do except to look at the National Assembly that has the oversight function to go and look into what they are spending this money on. So that's the third one. But whether should we borrow to pay for recurrent expenditure. This is why I was advising Senate 2 days ago that we need to look at the boundary conditions around fiscal stability, because fiscal stability accounts for no less than 60% of macroeconomic stability. So we must make sure that we are addressing all the boundaries, and that's why ECOWAS has 10 macroeconomic convergence criteria to enable us to move into a single currency. And I mentioned some of them, and that they must be mindful and put them in the law. And one of them is that you must peg personnel costs to no more than 35%, so that we are not running a bureaucracy where 70% of the budget goes to paying salaries, and then there's little left for the rest of the country. So that is a international best practice. And of course, the second one was that the deficit has to be within range. And as I said, I was happy for them to push the envelope to 3 to 4%, given the times that we face. The times we face is that we have COVID. COVID is an existential threat, and these things are not there forever. Then the third one I did mention was that the investment must continue to be an integral part, that government investing its own money, part of its own money, minimum of 20%. That's where you create jobs, you create infrastructure, you make sure that the economy is having all that it needs to be able to support growth. So those are the things I said, have all of these boundary conditions in the act, so that the thing will now be on autopilot. All the MDAs will be operating on the same level, all the states, the subnational government, federal government, local government, they will all be operating on the same indices, because according to the act, within section 42 says, within 90 days of passing this act, that was in 2007, the president should cause the Minister of Finance to advise him on the ratios in consultation with the National Assembly. And that hasn't happened. And so because it hasn't happened, the ratios like I just mentioned this one, the fiscal deficit at 3%. Now, that's the only one that was passed in the law. Then the ratio of total debt to GDP was not there. Domestic debt to GDP, foreign debt to GDP was not there. Even the debt service to government revenue, which according to best practice should be about 40%, is not there in the law. And then not to talk of all other indices that could make things easier and make officers and all levels of government operate within known boundaries of fiscal stability. So that is what I was advising Senate on Tuesday, and I think they took it very strongly, that they're going to write it into the law, and it will be good for us. So that not every day we will work on the same debate. Should it be here? Should it be there? No, it will be in the law, and they all work towards meeting. So when they are doing their budget, they will be testing the budget and say, oh, this amount is going to take us over the personnel cost. This one will take us over the debate. So they will be looking at those indices as they are preparing the budget.
You know, I mean, who knows how long it will take to reflect some of your suggestions in law. I mean, recent history shows that that can be quite tricky, referring to the Electoral Act Amendment Bill, even the PIB, how cantankerous it has been. But you say one of your major concerns is basically the debt service to revenue ratio, which is almost at 100%, really. So basically, we're making all the money just to service the debt, at least for the period under review this year, according to the report that was released by the ministry. So borrowing maybe might not be the challenge. It is paying back and having at least enough to sort other things. Do you see a way out? I mean, we know that Nigeria got out of debt during the President Obasanjo regime by miracle, as it were. Is that what we're looking for this time, or we have a plan, proper plan, medium, short, and long-term plan to really get out of this?
The point I'm trying to make is this, that we have the resources within our needs to support the level of borrowing that we have. There are leakages. There are leakages in the system. The quantum of the leakages are horrendous. When they looked at the same assembly on Tuesday, we are giving figures, the figures that dwarf the actual revenue, the figures about what is being given as tax exemptions and all those incentives, they dwarf the revenue. Then you look at the monies that are not being remitted to the treasury by the MDAs. It used to be 122 scheduled corporations. The assembly says everybody should go in, which means we are looking at nearly 1,000 MDAs, which is good. Let's have everybody and let the auditors and accountants decide whether you make profit or you don't make profit, and then whether you remit it or not remit it. And they have strong enforcement. I really like the enforcement section of the new amendment. And to let me tell you, this amendment is just weeks away from implementation. So that I have come confident about that. But the issues are that there are so many hostages to this fortune, and there are boundaries that we must draw so that managers know the tools that if you're going for medical checkup, is it only your blood pressure that you check? You check so many indices of health. You check your heart rate, you check so many indices that you check. So it's not just one thing or two things, borrowing and income. No, you have to look at all the boundaries of leakages and the payroll things. You've seen how many people are, all of those. So the boundaries are what I was mentioning to them, so that the managers, as they sit on their table at the level of the MDAs, local government, state government, federal government, they are all looking at macroeconomic indices, fiscal stability indices that enable them to plan well and know what they are agreeing to as additional borrowing. So that's what I'm saying. We had, okay, look at the tax revenue to GDP, which hovers between 6% and 8%. The average is 18%. Now, the macroeconomic convergence criteria for ECOWAS says minimum of 20%. So what I recommended to Senate yesterday was to move between 15 to 18% in the first instance. Let's aim at that. And the Minister of Finance has a program, very, very radical program to boost revenue. So they are heading to 3 times more revenue. So they're already heading in that direction. So they're not going to create any, it's not about overtaxing the existing tax constituents, but expanding the tax base, plugging the holes, and then getting all the assets to work, sweat the assets that we have. And one other thing that I also recommended to them on Tuesday was look at our assets. Let's do more borrowing based on our assets.
There are so many points to actually address on this matter. But, just as you highlighted, the MDAs, I mean, it's a huge one. It's not just about the tax, expanded tax base, as you say, because as we speak, I mean, there's several reports, several calls. I know my colleague, we call him Mr. Auditor General's report. He's highlighted that several times. The leakage is there. They're not being remitted. People need to see that these actions are being taken seriously. But we do thank you, as always, for your perspective this morning, Professor Ken Ife.